When a child's cry breaks the silence of the Montana plains, one drifter's choice between riding on or turning back becomes a race against death itself. Welcome to a story of redemption found in the most unexpected moment, when a hardened cowboy discovers that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply stop running. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of courage and second chances travels. Now, let me take you to the Montana Territory in 1877, where one evening changed everything. The late September sun hung low over the Montana plains, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and rust. Elias Thorne rode with the kind of stillness that comes from years of solitude, his hat pulled low against the slanting light, dust rising in lazy clouds behind his horse's hooves. The trail stretched endlessly before him, just as it had for the better part of 3 years. Empty, quiet, and blessedly free of complications. He preferred it that way. The gelding beneath him, a sturdy buckskin named Scout, moved with the rhythmic gait of a horse that knew his rider asked for nothing more than steady miles between one nameless town and the next. Elias's saddlebags carried everything he owned: bedroll, tin cup, a worn Bible he never opened, spare shirt, ammunition, and a leather pouch containing $43. Enough to keep moving, not enough to settle anywhere. That was the point. Behind him lay Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, a string of territories where he'd worked cattle drives, mended fences, broke horses, took whatever honest work paid in cash, and asked no questions. Ahead lay nothing in particular, which suited him fine. He'd learned the hard way that plans had a cruel habit of falling apart, that hope was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, that the only sure thing in this world was the certainty that if you kept moving, yesterday's failures couldn't quite catch up. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant water. Scout's ears flicked forward, then back, but Elias paid no mind. His thoughts drifted where they always did as daylight faded, to a farmhouse in Missouri, to a woman's laughter he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, to the child who would have been 2 years old by now, if Elias hadn't been too proud, too stubborn, too damn stupid to see what mattered until it was already gone. He shook his head sharply, focusing on the trail. That life was finished. This was what remained: leather reins, open country, and the blessed anonymity of a man who belonged nowhere. Then he heard it. At first, Elias thought it was a bird, some creature in distress, perhaps a wounded coyote pup. But as Scout's steps carried him closer, the sound clarified into something that made his chest tighten: a child crying. He pulled the reins instinctively, bringing Scout to a halt. The crying came from somewhere off the trail, beyond a cluster of scrub brush and weathered rocks, high-pitched, desperate, the kind of sobbing that spoke of terror rather than simple hurt. Every instinct Elias had spent 3 years cultivating screamed at him to keep riding. Children meant families. Families meant complications. Complications meant exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. Nothing good came from stopping. Nothing good came from caring. He touched his heels to Scout's flanks, ready to move on. The crying intensified. Ragged, breathless, the sound of someone who'd been screaming for help until their voice gave out. Elias's jaw clenched. "Not my business," he muttered to Scout, who stood perfectly still, ears trained on the sound. But his hands wouldn't cooperate. Instead of urging the horse forward, he found himself swinging down from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud that felt like surrender. He looped Scout's reins loosely over a low branch and moved toward the sound, hand resting on the revolver at his hip, more from habit than expectation of danger. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from days of silence. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. Elias pushed through the brush, and that's when he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, crouched beside a flat stone, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her dress torn at the hem. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around thin shoulders that shook with each breath. When she looked up at him, her eyes, wide and brown and filled with desperate hope, struck him like a physical blow. For one terrible moment he saw another child, one who existed only in his imagination, one he'd never meet. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, you have to help." Elias's throat felt tight. "Help with what? Where's your family?" She scrambled to her feet, stumbling toward him with an urgency that made him step back instinctively. Small hands grabbed at his sleeve, his vest clinging with surprising strength. "My mama," she choked out. "She's sick. Real sick. She won't wake up right. And she's burning up, and I don't know what to do." and nobody will help. And please, please. The words tumbled over each other, dissolving into fresh tears. Elias's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. A sick woman, a child alone on the plains, no sign of anyone else. Could be fever. Could be cholera. Could be any number of things that killed people out here. Where doctors were scarce and help was scarcer. Could be a trap, whispered the cynical part of him that had kept him alive this long. But as he looked down at the girl's tear-stained face, at the genuine terror in her eyes, at the way her whole body trembled with fear and exhaustion, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't a trap. It was something worse. A real problem with no easy answers. The kind of situation that demanded he become someone he'd deliberately stopped being. "Where's your mama?" he heard himself ask. The girl's face flooded with relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Home. Our cabin. It's not far, maybe 2 miles that way." She pointed west toward the darkening horizon. "Please, mister, please come. I've been trying to get help all day, but nobody," her voice broke, "nobody would listen." Elias's hands clenched at his sides. What kind of place was this, where a child begging for help got turned away? But even as the thought formed, he knew the answer. The kind of place where people had their own troubles, where strangers were viewed with suspicion, where getting involved in someone else's misery might bring unwanted complications, the kind of thinking he'd adopted himself. "All right," he said quietly, and watched hope kindle in her eyes like a struck match. "Show me." She grabbed his hand, her fingers small and cold despite the lingering warmth of the day, and tugged him back toward where Scout waited. Elias whistled low and the buckskin lifted his head, ears forward. "What's your name?" Elias asked as he gathered the reins. "Sarah," she said, practically vibrating with urgency. "Sarah Vance. And my mama is Clara. She got sick 3 days ago and it just keeps getting worse. And I tried to make her better, but I don't know how." "And?" "Easy," Elias said, cutting through the torrent of words with gentle firmness. He swung into the saddle, then reached down. "Can you ride?" Sarah nodded frantically. Elias grasped her under the arms and lifted her up, settling her in front of him. She weighed almost nothing, all sharp angles and desperate energy. The moment she was secure, she pointed west. "That way. Hurry, please hurry." Elias touched his heels to Scout's sides, and the buckskin moved into an easy lope. The sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the grasslands. Sarah sat rigid in his arms, her whole body leaning forward, as if she could will the horse to move faster. "How long have you been alone with your mama?" Elias asked, keeping his voice level. "Since Papa died," Sarah said, her words matter-of-fact in the way children spoke of unbearable things. "Last winter, he was cutting wood and a tree fell wrong and hit him in the chest. Mama said his ribs broke inside, and there wasn't nothing to be done. He died the next day." Elias's chest constricted. A widow and child alone through a Montana winter. The fact that they'd survived it all spoke to either tremendous strength or sheer stubborn luck. What about neighbors? Anybody nearby who could help? Sarah's shoulders hunched. The Bensons live about 5 miles east, but Mrs. Benson told Mama after Papa died that they couldn't afford to be helping us all the time, that we should go back east where we came from, and the Harpers are even farther. And they never liked us anyway because Mama didn't go to their church. The casual cruelty of it settled over Elias like a familiar coat. He'd seen it before, hell, he'd practiced it himself. People were quick enough with sympathy when it cost them nothing, but when real help was needed, when someone's survival depended on genuine sacrifice, most folks found reasons to look the other way. "When did your mama get sick?" "Started 3 days ago. At first, she just said she was tired. But then she got the shakes real bad and started burning up. Yesterday, she stopped making sense when she talked. And this morning, she wouldn't wake up right. Her eyes would open, but she didn't see me. And she kept saying things that didn't make no sense, talking to Papa like he was still here. Delirium. High fever, 3 days in." Elias had seen enough fever deaths on cattle drives to know the signs. If Clara Vance had been alone, with just a frightened child to care for her, odds were good she hadn't had proper water, proper cooling, proper anything. "You went for help today?" Sarah nodded miserably. "I ran to the Bensons' first light this morning." Mrs. Benson opened the door, saw it was me, and said they already done enough for us, and she wasn't about to catch whatever sickness we had. Wouldn't even let me come inside. Then I tried the Harpers, but nobody answered, even though I could see smoke from their chimney. Then I thought maybe if I went to the trail, somebody passing through might help, somebody who didn't know to turn away. Her voice had gotten smaller with each sentence, as if she was only now realizing how close she'd come to complete failure, how narrow the margin had been between finding help and returning to watch her mother die. "You found me," Elias said simply. "I heard your horse," Sarah whispered. "I'd been sitting by that rock for hours, and I'd about given up. And then I heard hoofbeats, and I thought maybe this time, maybe just this once, somebody would listen." The weight of that hope, the desperate faith this child had placed in a complete stranger, simply because he was the only option left, settled over Elias like a physical burden. He wanted to tell her she'd been lucky, that he almost hadn't stopped, that every instinct he possessed had told him to keep riding. But she was 7 years old and terrified, so instead he said, "How much farther?" "Just over that rise." Sarah pointed to a low ridge ahead, silhouetted against the reddening sky. "Our cabin is in the hollow on the other side." Elias urged Scout into a faster pace, the buckskins breathing steady despite the added weight and quickened gait. They crested the rise, and Elias's heart sank at what he saw below. The cabin huddled in the shallow valley, like something trying to disappear into the earth. Weathered logs, gaps visible between them even from a distance, roof sagging on one side, patched with what looked like canvas or hide. A lean-to that might have once housed livestock stood empty, its door hanging crooked. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cooling evening air. No sign of life, no movement, nothing to suggest anyone lived there at all, except for a small garden plot, mostly withered now, and a rain barrel by the door. This wasn't just isolation. This was abandonment, a family forgotten by their community, left to survive or fail on their own. "That's home," Sarah said quietly, and something in her voice suggested she knew exactly how it looked, knew the judgment that formed in most people's eyes when they saw it. Elias said nothing, just guided Scout down the slope toward the cabin. As they drew closer, more details emerged. Clothes hanging stiff on a line, never brought in, a bucket overturned by the door, the garden tools scattered, as if dropped mid-task. These were the signs of crisis, of a household where the normal rhythms had shattered. He pulled Scout to a stop by the cabin door and dismounted, then lifted Sarah down. She immediately ran to the door, pushing it open without hesitation. "Mama, Mama, I brought help." Elias followed her inside, and the smell hit him first. Sweat, sickness, the close air of a room that hadn't been opened in days. The cabin's interior was dim, evening light filtering weakly through a single small window. His eyes adjusted, taking in details. A table with 2 chairs, both handmade but well-crafted, shelves that were mostly empty, containing a few dishes, some jars, a tin cup. A cold fireplace, ashes days old, and in the corner, a narrow bed where a woman lay motionless. Sarah was already at her side, small hands touching her mother's face. "Mama, wake up. Please wake up. I brought somebody to help." Elias moved closer, his boots loud on the plank floor. Clara Vance lay on her back, covered with a thin quilt, her face flushed with fever even in the dim light. Her dark hair, so like her daughter's, spread damp across a pillow that had clearly been wet and dried several times. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, rapid and irregular. He knelt beside the bed, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him pull back instinctively. Dangerously high, the kind of fever that could cook a person's brain if it lasted too long. "Mama?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Mama, can you hear me?" Clara's eyes opened slightly, unfocused and glassy. Her lips moved, forming words that made no sound, then barely audible. "Sarah?" "I'm here, Mama, and I brought help. A man who's going to make you better." Clara's gaze shifted toward Elias, but he could tell she wasn't really seeing him. She was looking through him, or past him, to something only fever visions revealed. "Jacob," she whispered. "Jacob, you came back?" Sarah's face crumpled. "That's Papa's name," she told Elias. "She keeps thinking he's here." Elias stood, his mind racing through what he knew about frontier medicine, which wasn't much beyond the basics learned on trail drives. High fever needed to be brought down. That meant water, cool compresses, possibly willow bark, if any could be found. But this had been going on for 3 days. Clara needed a doctor, needed real help, not the fumbling attempts of a drifter who knew more about horses than healing. He turned to Sarah, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a town nearby? Somewhere with a doctor?" "Cedar Creek," Sarah said immediately. "About 8 miles northeast. But Mama said we couldn't afford the doctor, that he charges $20 just to come out here, and we don't have that kind of money." 8 miles, in daylight on a fresh horse, maybe an hour's hard ride. in the gathering darkness over unfamiliar terrain closer to 2 hours, and then convincing a doctor to come. Gathering supplies, making the ride back, they were looking at 4 hours minimum, probably 5 or 6. Elias looked at Clara's flushed face, at the way her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements. Did she have 6 hours? Did she even have 3? Listen to me, he said to Sarah, crouching down to meet her eyes. I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that? She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. First, I need water. All you can get, is that rain barrel full? Yes, sir. Good. Get me that bucket by the door and fill it. Then I need any clean cloth you can find. Old shirts, rags, anything. And I need you to get that fire going. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We got wood stacked outside. All right, go. Move fast, but don't spill the water. We need every drop. Sarah darted for the door, and Elias turned back to Clara. He'd made his decision without consciously realizing it. He couldn't get to town and back fast enough. His only chance was to do what he could here now, and hope it was enough to keep her alive until morning, when he could ride for proper help in daylight. He pulled the thin quilt back, noting Clara's sweat-soaked dress. The fever needed to be fought, which meant getting her temperature down however possible. He'd seen cowboys survive fever by being dunked in cold streams. Seen others die despite every effort. There were no guarantees out here. Just desperate measures and prayer. Though Elias wasn't much for praying anymore, Sarah returned, struggling under the weight of a full bucket. Water sloshed over the sides as she set it down beside the bed. I got cloth, too, she said, producing an armful of what looked like old flour sacks and a worn shirt. Good girl, Elias said and meant it. Now the fire, fast as you can. While Sarah worked at the fireplace, Elias dunked one of the rags in the cold water and wrung it out. He pressed it against Clara's forehead. She stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips. He worked methodically, cooling her face, her neck, her arms, replacing the rags as they warmed from her skin's heat. Jacob, Clara murmured again, her head turning restlessly. The baby, where's the baby? Elias's hand stilled for just a moment. Then he continued working, jaw tight. Sarah appeared at his elbow, having coaxed flames to life in the fireplace. She keeps saying that about a baby, but there ain't no baby, mister, just me. Sometimes fever makes people remember things, Elias said quietly, things that hurt. Was there another baby? One that died, Sarah said. I don't know, Elias said, though he suspected he did know. Clara's flat stomach, Sarah's words about her father dying last winter. The references to a baby, it painted a clear enough picture, loss upon loss upon loss. For the next hour, Elias worked in a steady rhythm. Cool water, fresh rags, checking Clara's temperature. Trying to get her to take small sips of water when her eyes opened enough to attempt it. Sarah helped without being asked, fetching more water, keeping the fire fed, hovering close to her mother's bedside. As full darkness fell outside, Clara's breathing seemed to ease slightly, the desperate gasps becoming a bit more regular. Her fever remained dangerously high, but perhaps not quite as scorching as before. Small mercies, Elias thought. Out here you took what you could get. Is she going to die? Sarah asked suddenly, her voice very small in the firelit cabin. Elias wanted to lie, to offer easy comfort, but this child had already survived more truth than most adults ever faced. She deserved honesty. I don't know, he said, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she doesn't. And come first light, I'm riding to town to bring back a doctor. You'll come back? The question held desperate hope and learned skepticism in equal measure. You won't just leave? Elias met her eyes, seeing the fear there, not just of losing her mother, but of being abandoned by the one person who'd stopped to help. And in that moment, he understood what it meant to make a promise that mattered. The kind that couldn't be walked away from. I'll come back, he said. I give you my word. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if she'd seen something there that satisfied her. I believe you. They worked through the evening in quiet partnership, child and stranger, bound by shared purpose. Elias found himself talking to Clara as he worked, keeping up a steady stream of words, even though she likely couldn't hear him. You're doing fine, ma'am. Just keep breathing. Your daughter's here, and she's the bravest little girl I've ever seen. Rode out alone looking for help. Didn't give up, even when folks turned her away. You raised her right, so you need to fight now. Need to hang on because she needs you, and I'm guessing you're not the kind of woman who gives up easy. Not if you made it through a winter alone out here. Around midnight, Clara's eyes opened more clearly than they had since he'd arrived. Her gaze found Sarah first, and something like recognition flickered there. Sarah. Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and broken. "I'm here, Mama." Sarah grasped her mother's hand. "I'm right here." "I'm sorry," Clara breathed. "So sorry. Should have taken you away from here." "Don't talk like that," Sarah said fiercely. "You're gonna get better. This man." She gestured to Elias. "He's helping. And tomorrow he's bringing a doctor." Clara's eyes shifted to Elias, and for the first time he saw real awareness there along with something else. Shame, he realized. She was ashamed to be seen like this. Helpless and dependent on a stranger's charity. "Don't," he said quietly, understanding without being told. "You've got nothing to apologize for. You're sick, and that's not something you chose." "Don't have money for a doctor," Clara managed. "We'll figure that out tomorrow," Elias said. "Right now, you just focus on staying alive." "Who are you?" "Name's Elias Thorne. I was passing through and your daughter asked for help, so I helped." Something that might have been a smile touched Clara's cracked lips. "Lucky," she whispered. She was lucky. "We both were," Elias said, surprising himself with the truth of it. Clara's eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing had settled into something more natural, less desperate. The fever still burned, but she'd crossed back from whatever edge she'd been teetering on. At least for now. As false dawn began to gray the cabin's single window, Sarah finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling up in the chair beside her mother's bed, her small hand still clasping Clara's. Elias kept his vigil, changing the water when it grew warm, keeping the fire fed, and somewhere in those quiet hours, he felt something he'd been running from for 3 years finally catch up to him. Purpose. The sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed doing. It terrified him more than any outlaw or stampede ever had, because he'd learned that purpose came with a price, and he wasn't sure he could afford to pay it again. But as the first light touched the eastern sky, and he prepared to ride for Cedar Creek, Elias knew with absolute certainty that he'd already made the choice. The moment he'd heard a child crying and decided to stop, he'd committed himself to seeing this through. Whatever it cost, whatever it demanded, whatever it changed in him, he would see it through. He would keep his promise. The sun broke over the Montana plains in shades of copper and gold as Elias tightened Scout's cinch, checking his saddle one final time. The buckskin shifted beneath his hand, sensing the urgency that had driven them through the night. Behind him, the cabin door stood open. Through it, he could see Sarah sitting rigid in the chair beside her mother's bed, her small frame silhouetted against the firelight that still burned, despite the dawn. He walked back inside, his boots heavy on the worn floorboards. Clara lay as she had for hours, her breathing shallow but steady, her fever-flushed face almost peaceful in the early light. The water bucket sat half-empty beside the bed, surrounded by damp rags that testified to the long night's battle. "I'm leaving now," Elias said quietly, crouching beside Sarah's chair. "But I need you to keep doing exactly what we did last night. Cool water on her face and neck. Try to get her to drink whenever she wakes. Keep that fire going, but not too hot. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "How long will you be gone?" 4 hours if everything goes right. Maybe 5. If I'm not back by noon, it means I had trouble finding the doctor or convincing him to come. But I will come back, understand? No matter what. What if Mama gets worse while you're gone? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the terrible possibilities neither wanted to name. Elias reached out and placed his hand over Sarah's small one where it rested on the chair's arm. "Then you talk to her," he said. "You tell her about things she loves. Remind her why she needs to fight. Sometimes that's all we can do. Just refuse to let go." Sarah's chin trembled, but she didn't cry. "My papa used to say Mama was the stubbornest woman in 3 territories," said once she set her mind to something heaven itself couldn't move her. Then remind her she's got something to be stubborn about. Elias stood, adjusting his gun belt out of habit. "I'm leaving Scout's water bucket by the door, and there's jerky in my saddlebag if you get hungry. Don't wait for me to eat, Mr. Thorne." Sarah's voice stopped him at the threshold. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Elias turned back, and for a moment he saw not this cabin, but another one years ago, and states away. And a different woman who'd needed help he'd been too proud to ask for until it was too late. The memory cut sharp and clean the way old wounds sometimes did. Maybe that's exactly why, he said finally. Because I don't know you, so I can't make the same mistakes twice. He didn't wait for her response, just stepped out into the morning air and swung into the saddle. Scout moved into an easy trot, then a canter as Elias pointed him northeast towards Cedar Creek. The plains stretched endlessly around them, the grass still silvered with dew, the sky vast and cloudless overhead. As the cabin disappeared behind a rise, Elias felt the familiar pull of the trail, that old instinct to just keep riding, to leave this complication behind and return to the simple mathematics of survival that had sustained him for 3 years. No one would blame him. He'd done more than most would have, more than those neighbors who'd turned a desperate child away. He could ride into Cedar Creek, tell someone about the sick woman and her daughter, leave it to people whose job it was to care, and be 10 miles gone before noon. The thought lasted maybe 30 seconds before shame burned it away. He'd given his word to a 7-year-old girl who'd already learned that most words were empty. That meant something, or it meant nothing at all. And if it meant nothing, then he'd spent 3 years running from one failed promise only to become the kind of man who made another one. Elias urged Scout faster, the buckskin responding with the smooth power of a horse bred for hard country and long distances. The sun climbed higher, warming his back, and the miles fell away beneath them. He passed a homestead where a man was already working his field, stopped at a creek to let Scout drink and blow, then pushed on as the town of Cedar Creek began to take shape on the horizon. It wasn't much. Maybe 40 buildings clustered along a single main street, with a handful of houses scattered beyond. A church steeple rose at the far end, white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Signs identified a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a blacksmith, and there on the south side of the street, a neat clapboard building with a shingle that read, Dr. Harrison Sullivan, physician and surgeon. Elias pulled Scout to a stop outside and dismounted, looping the reins over the hitching post. His legs protested after the hard ride, but he ignored the stiffness and climbed the 3 steps to the doctor's door. It was barely past 7 in the morning. He knocked, waited, then knocked again harder. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a collarless shirt and suspenders. His expression suggested he'd been woken from sleep and wasn't pleased about it. Office hours start at 9, the doctor said curtly. Come back then. He started to close the door, but Elias's boot wedged into the gap. I've got a woman dying 8 miles from here. She needs help now, not in 2 hours. Dr. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. I'm not a charity operation, friend. My services cost money. $20 for a house call plus treatment fees. Can you pay? I've got $43, Elias said, and whatever that's not enough to cover, I'll work off. But this woman has been fevered for 3 days. She's got a 7-year-old daughter caring for her alone. And if we don't get to her soon, you won't need to worry about payment, because there won't be anyone left to treat. The doctor's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his eyes. A calculation being made. Where's this woman located? Vance Place. Hollow about 2 miles west of the main trail, 8 miles southwest of here. Clara Vance. Dr. Sullivan's mouth pressed into a thin line. I know who you're talking about. Widow woman lost her husband last winter, been scraping by alone with her daughter ever since. You know her situation and you're standing here negotiating price. I know she's got no money, the doctor shot back. I know I made 2 house calls out there last year when her husband was dying, and I haven't seen payment for either one. I'm sympathetic, friend, but sympathy doesn't pay my bills or feed my family. Elias's hand tightened on the door frame. Every word the doctor said made practical sense. And that made it worse somehow, the way pragmatism could justify almost any failure of basic human decency. She's dying, Elias said flatly, and her daughter is watching it happen. If that doesn't move you, then I'll find someone it does move. There's no other doctor within 50 miles, Dr. Sullivan said. But his tone had lost some of its hard edge, and I didn't say I wouldn't go. I said I needed to know about payment. Your $43 will cover the initial visit and basic treatment. If she needs medicine, surgery, extended care, that's extra. Fine. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather pouch, emptying it into his palm. $43 in mixed coins and crumpled bills. Every cent he owned. He held it out. Take it. All of it. Just move, doctor. Sullivan took the money with hands that showed the tremor of age or too much whiskey, counting it twice before nodding. Give me 10 minutes to gather supplies. There's a trough around back if your horse needs water. The door closed, leaving Elias standing on the porch with empty pockets, and a growing knot of anxiety in his chest. He led Scout to the trough and let the buckskin drink. While the sun climbed higher and people began emerging from houses, starting their daily routines, a woman sweeping her front steps paused to stare at him. Two men heading toward the blacksmith forge glanced his way and kept walking. Small town, Elias thought. Everyone knows everyone else's business, and strangers get noticed. Dr. Sullivan emerged carrying a worn leather medical bag and a canvas sack that clinked with bottles. He'd added a coat despite the warming day, and carried himself with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd made this kind of emergency call more times than he cared to count. "I've got my own horse," he said. "Follow me. And I hope for your sake this woman's condition is as serious as you claim, because I don't appreciate being dragged out at dawn for situations that could wait for office hours." "You'll see soon enough," Elias said. They rode in silence, the doctor mounted on a serviceable mare that looked better fed than most horses in these parts. A cedar creek fell behind them. Dr. Sullivan glanced over at Elias. With the assessing look doctors seemed to develop alongside their medical skills. "You're not from around here?" He said it wasn't quite a question. "No, passing through." "Was family to Mrs. Vance?" "Never met her before last night." Dr. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. "That right. So what's your interest in all this?" Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Her daughter found me on the trail and asked for help. I helped. Noble of you, nothing noble about it, just the only thing that made sense at the time." They rode another mile before the doctor spoke again. "You know, I've practiced medicine for 30 years. Started in Philadelphia, came west after the war thinking I'd make a difference out here on the frontier. And you know what I learned? That people are people no matter where you go. Some will bleed you dry asking for help they don't need. Others will die before they'll ask for help they do need. Clara Vance is the second kind. That's why nobody helped her yesterday when her daughter went asking." "Is that what she told you?" Dr. Sullivan shook his head. "The Bensons are struggling themselves. Lost half their cattle to disease last spring. The Harpers are good people, but they're 70 years old and barely managing their own place. It's not that folks don't care. It's that everyone out here is one bad season away from disaster. Helping your neighbor is noble until it means your own children go hungry." "And which kind are you, doctor? The kind who helps, or the kind who can't afford to?" Dr. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "I'm the kind who shows up, friend. Even when I don't get paid. Even when it means riding 8 miles out of my way, so you can climb down off that mortal high ground you're sitting on, and recognize that maybe, just maybe, you're not the only person trying to do right in a situation with no good answers." The rebuke landed harder than Elias wanted to admit. He'd been so quick to judge, so ready to see everyone else's failure that he'd missed the simple truth. The doctor had come. Not happily, not quickly, but he'd come. That counted for something. "You're right," Elias said after a moment. "I apologize." They crested the rise, and the hollow came into view below. In full daylight, the Vance cabin looked even more desolate than it had the night before, a testament to stubborn survival against overwhelming odds. Smoke rose from the chimney, which Elias took as a good sign. Sarah was following instructions, keeping the fire going. "How bad was she when you left?" Dr. Sullivan asked as they descended toward the cabin. "Bad. High fever, delirious, barely conscious. I spent the night trying to cool her down with water, got her to take a few sips here and there. She was still alive when I left at dawn, but that's about all I can tell you. 3 days fevered, you said, according to her daughter. Could be typhoid, could be pneumonia, could be a dozen other things." The doctor's professional demeanor had taken over, his earlier irritation replaced by focused concentration. "The fact that she's lasted 3 days is actually promising. The ones that are going to die fast usually do it in the first 48 hours. They pulled up outside the cabin, and before Elias could dismount, the door burst open and Sarah came running out, her face transformed by relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You came back," she breathed, stopping just short of grabbing Elias's stirrup. "You really came back. Told you I would." Elias swung down and turned to Dr. Sullivan, who was already gathering his bags. "This is Sarah Vance." "Sarah, this is Dr. Sullivan. He's going to help your mama." Sarah's eyes went wide as she took in the doctor's presence, his official medical bag, the bottles clinking in his canvas sack. For a moment she just stood there, and then she did something that caught both men off guard. She burst into tears. Not the desperate crying of the day before, but the kind of weeping that comes when someone who's been holding themselves together by sheer will finally feel safe enough to fall apart. Great heaving sobs that shook her thin frame, tears streaming down her face. As 3 days of terror and loneliness and desperate responsibility finally broke through, Elias knelt beside her, awkward and uncertain. "Hey now, it's all right. The doctor's here. Your mama's going to be fine." I thought, Sarah gasped between sobs. I thought nobody was coming. I thought she was going to die, and it would be just me, and I didn't know what to do. "But we are here," Elias said firmly. "And you did everything right. Everything. You kept her alive until help could come. That took more courage than most grown men have." Dr. Sullivan cleared his throat. "The girl can cry after I've examined her mother. Right now, I need to get inside and assess the situation. Miss Sarah, can you compose yourself enough to answer some questions?" Sarah wiped her eyes with her sleeve and nodded, sniffing hard. "Yes, sir, I can do that." "Good girl, lead the way." The cabin's interior smelled of smoke and sickness, and the lingering dampness of the water Elias had used through the night. Clara lay exactly as he'd left her, though someone, Sarah, he assumed had pulled the quilt higher and placed a fresh, damp cloth on her forehead. Dr. Sullivan set his bags on the table and approached the bed with the practiced movements of a man who'd examined countless patients in conditions far worse than this. He pressed his fingers to Clara's wrist, counting her pulse, then placed his hand on her forehead, her neck, her chest. "Mrs. Vance," he said loudly, clearly. "Can you hear me?" "It's Dr. Sullivan from Cedar Creek." Clara's eyes fluttered but didn't open. A small sound escaped her lips, something between a moan and a word. "She was talking this morning," Sarah offered from the doorway. "Not making much sense, but she knew I was here. She asked for water, and I gave her some, and she drank it." "That's very good," Dr. Sullivan said absently, his attention focused on his patient. He pulled back the quilt, examining Clara's sweat-soaked dress. The way her chest rose and fell, the flush that colored her skin from forehead to collarbone. Elias stood near the fireplace, feeling suddenly useless. This was the doctor's realm now, a world of diagnosis and treatments he knew nothing about. All he could do was wait and hope that his midnight ride had been fast enough. Dr. Sullivan opened his medical bag and extracted a stethoscope, pressing it to Clara's chest and listening intently. Then he examined her eyes, her tongue, her hands. The inspection took maybe 5 minutes, but felt like an hour. Finally, the doctor straightened and turned to face Sarah and Elias. "It's pneumonia," he said without preamble. "Both lungs are involved, which explains the high fever and delirium. She's also severely dehydrated, which is making everything worse. Can you help her?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I can try. But I need to be honest with you, child. Your mother is very sick. If this had gone on another day, maybe even another 12 hours, I don't think there would have been anything I could do. As it is, the next 24 hours will be critical, but she's going to live." Sarah pressed. "You can make her live?" Dr. Sullivan's expression softened slightly. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she does. But I can't make you promises I might not be able to keep. What I can tell you is that she's got a fighting chance now. And she didn't have that yesterday. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, though her face had gone pale. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the fine tremor that ran through her. "What do you need?" he asked the doctor. "Hot water, clean cloths, somewhere to work, and I'm going to need both of you out of the cabin for about an hour while I examine her properly and get her into clean clothes. Can you manage that?" Elias nodded. "Come on, Sarah, let's give the doctor room to work." They stepped outside into the morning sun, which had climbed high enough now to banish the last cool shadows. Elias led Sarah to a fallen log near the empty lean-to, and they sat. The girl tucked against his side like she'd been doing it all her life. "Is he really going to save her?" Sarah asked quietly. "He's going to try his best. That's all any of us can do. What if his best isn't enough?" The question deserved honesty, even though honesty was a hard thing to give a 7-year-old who'd already lost so much. Elias took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Then we'll deal with that if it comes. But right now, your mama's got something she didn't have 12 hours ago. She's got a doctor who knows what he's doing. She's got medicine. She's got help. Those are good odds, Sarah. Better than most people get out here." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun track across the sky. Eventually, Sarah spoke again, her voice small. "Mr. Thorne, after Mama gets better, are you going to leave?" The question struck at something Elias had been avoiding thinking about since dawn. Of course he was going to leave. That's what he did. That's what he'd been doing for 3 years. He'd never intended to stop, never planned to put down roots or make connections or become the kind of man people relied on. But sitting there with this child pressed against his side, in the yard of a cabin that represented stubborn survival against impossible odds, looking at his empty pockets and thinking about the promise he'd made, Elias realized that leaving wasn't quite as simple as it used to be. "I don't know," he said finally. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "Mama's going to need help when she's better," Sarah said, with the careful tone of someone making a case they know is fragile. "She can't work the place alone, and I'm too small to do much. And you said you'd work off what the doctor costs, so maybe you could stay. At least for a little while, just until Mama's strong again." Every instinct Elias had developed over 3 years of drifting screamed at him to shut this down immediately, to make it clear he'd done his part and owed nothing more, to protect himself from the kind of entanglement that could only end badly. But he looked at Sarah's hopeful face, at this child who'd watched her father die and nearly lost her mother, and been turned away by neighbors who should have helped, and he couldn't bring himself to take away the small hope that had kindled in her eyes. "We'll see," he said instead. "Let's get your mama well first, then worry about what comes after." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. Sarah seemed to understand the distinction, because she nodded and leaned harder against him, a small gesture of trust that felt heavier than any burden Elias had ever carried. They waited. The sun climbed higher, Scout, and the doctor's mare grazed peacefully on the sparse grass near the cabin. Inside, they could hear the occasional sound of movement, the clink of bottles, the doctor's voice speaking in low tones, though Clara couldn't possibly respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably closer to one, the cabin door opened. Dr. Sullivan emerged, rolling down his sleeves and looking tired but not defeated. "You can come in now," he said. "I've done what I can for the immediate crisis." They followed him inside to find Clara still in bed, but now dressed in a clean nightgown, her hair brushed back from her face, her skin looking less alarmingly flushed than before. The cabin had been aired out, the sick smell replaced by the sharp scent of camphor and something else medicinal. Clean cloths sat in neat stacks on the table beside several dark bottles. "She's sleeping naturally now," Dr. Sullivan explained, "which is what she needs most. I've administered willow bark for the fever and a tincture for her lungs. She needs water constantly, small sips every time she wakes, and she needs to be kept cool, but not cold. That means damp cloths regularly, but also making sure she stays covered so she doesn't catch a chill." "I can do that," Sarah said immediately. "I know you can. You've done an admirable job keeping her alive this long." The doctor pulled out a small dark bottle from his bag. "This is laudanum for the pain and to help her rest. 2 drops in water 3 times a day, no more. Too much and it will suppress her breathing, which is the last thing we want. Can you measure 2 drops? "Yes, sir." "Show me." Sarah took the bottle carefully and counted out exactly 2 drops into the tin cup, her small face serious with concentration. "Perfect. Now, I'm leaving this bottle along with the fever tincture and the lung medicine. I've written instructions for each one." He handed her a folded paper covered in neat handwriting. "Can you read?" "Yes, sir. Mama taught me." "Excellent. Follow these instructions exactly. No more, no less. I'll come back tomorrow to check on her progress. If she takes a turn for the worse before then, if she starts bleeding from the mouth or nose, if her breathing becomes labored to the point she can't speak, if the fever spikes again despite the medicine, you send for me immediately. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, but her hands trembled slightly as she took the paper. Dr. Sullivan turned to Elias. "You'll be staying?" It wasn't really a question, and Elias found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided, "For now. Good. This girl shouldn't be alone out here. And Mrs. Vance is going to need round-the-clock care for at least the next few days. Can you handle that? I've kept people alive on cattle drives with less medicine than you're leaving. I can manage." "I'm sure you can." The doctor began packing his bags with efficient movements. "I'll be back tomorrow around noon. With any luck, we'll see significant improvement by then. Mrs. Vance is strong, stronger than she has any right to be given her circumstances. That counts for more than people realize." He paused at the door, turning back to face them. "And when she wakes up properly, tell her she still owes me for those house calls last winter. I don't forget debts, but I also don't collect from the dead. So she'd better make sure to recover." The words were gruff, but Elias caught the faint smile that accompanied them, and understood that this was how Dr. Sullivan expressed hope. through practical reminders of obligations that only mattered if the patient survived to fulfill them. After the doctor left, the cabin fell into a different kind of silence. One shaped by cautious hope rather than desperate fear. Sarah stationed herself beside her mother's bed with the medicine bottles lined up precisely, and the instruction paper smoothed flat where she could read it easily. Elias checked the fire, brought in more wood from the stack outside, and then stood awkwardly in the center of the small cabin, aware that he'd somehow transitioned from passing stranger to household fixture without quite meaning to. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah said, without looking up from her mother. "I'm hungry." The simple statement made Elias realize he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. Some dried meat yesterday afternoon, maybe. Time had blurred into a continuous string of crisis and response, leaving no room for normal human needs. "Me, too," he admitted. "What have you got for food?" "There's some cornmeal in the jar on the top shelf, and I think there's still some salt pork in the cold box out back. Mama was saving it for when—" She paused, swallowing hard. "For when she got better." "Well, she is getting better," Elias said firmly. "So I think we can count this as when." "Can you make cornbread?" "I can try." They worked together in the small kitchen area, Sarah talking him through where her mother kept things, Elias doing the actual work of mixing cornmeal with water and a precious bit of lard, shaping it into rough cakes to fry in the pan over the fire. The salt pork was old but still good, and the smell of cooking food seemed to wake something in both of them. A return to normalcy, to the simple rituals of survival that had nothing to do with sickness or fear. They ate sitting on the cabin's doorstep, plates balanced on their knees, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the hollow. The food was plain but filling, the kind of meal that tasted better than it had any right to, simply because it represented being alive and together and moving forward. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah said around a mouthful of cornbread. "Thank you." "For what?" "For stopping, for coming back, for staying." She set down her plate and looked at him with eyes too serious for her age. Most people wouldn't have done any of that. Elias thought about all the times he hadn't stopped, all the people he'd passed who might have needed help. He'd been too self-absorbed to notice, all the years he'd spent convinced that keeping moving was the same thing as staying alive. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but you deserved someone who would." They finished eating as the sun began its long descent toward evening. Inside the cabin, Clara Vance slept on, breathing steadily, fever slowly retreating, held to life by medicine and stubborn will, and the love of a daughter who'd refused to let her go. The first night passed in shifts. Elias dozed in the chair by the fire, while Sarah curled up on a pallet of blankets near her mother's bed, both of them waking at intervals to check Clara's breathing, change the damp cloths on her forehead, measure out careful drops of medicine. By the time dawnlight crept through the cabin's single window, they moved through the routine with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd served together for years, rather than strangers who'd met barely 36 hours before. Clara woke properly just after sunrise, her eyes clear for the first time since Elias had arrived. She turned her head slowly, taking in the clean cabin, the medicines on the table, her daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, and finally, the strange man stirring the fire with movements that suggested he'd made himself at home. "You're real," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but coherent. "I thought maybe I dreamed you." Elias set down the poker and crossed to the bedside, automatically reaching to check her forehead. The heat had diminished considerably, leaving her skin warm but no longer dangerously hot. "I'm real enough. Name's Elias Thorne. Your daughter found me on the trail 2 days ago." 2 days? Clara's brow furrowed. "I don't remember. There are pieces missing. Fevered dreams, maybe. Or just nothing. That's normal. According to the doctor, you had pneumonia. Bad case. He says you're going to pull through, but you need to rest. And take your medicine, and not try to do too much too fast." Clara's hand moved restlessly on the quilt, and Elias saw her taking inventory of her situation with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that spoke to hard-won survival skills. Stranger in her home. Medicine bottles she couldn't have afforded. Her daughter apparently under this man's care. The arithmetic of debt and obligation was practically visible in her expression. "I can't pay you," she said finally. "Can't pay the doctor either. I've got maybe $3 put by. And that's meant for winter supplies." "Already settled with the doctor," Elias said, his tone suggesting the matter wasn't up for discussion. "And I don't want your $3. What I want is for you to drink some water, and maybe eat something if you think you can keep it down." "You don't understand." Clara tried to push herself up on her elbows. But the effort left her breathless and trembling. I don't take charity. I won't be beholden to. Then don't think of it as charity. Elias kept his voice level, recognizing pride when he saw it, because he'd worn the same armor himself. Think of it as neighbors helping neighbors. Think of it as human decency. Think of it however you need to. But right now, what matters is that you get well enough to take care of your daughter, because she's been through hell worrying about you. And she deserves to have her mother back. The mention of Sarah made something in Clara's face crumble. Her eyes moved to where her daughter slept, the exhaustion visible even in sleep. Dark circles under her eyes. Tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. She went for help, Clara said softly. I remember that much. She kept saying she'd find someone, and I kept telling her not to. That nobody would come, that she should just stay with me so I could. So at least she wouldn't be alone. When she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Elias had seen enough death on the frontier to know the shape of those thoughts, the way people made peace with endings when they couldn't see any other way forward. Well, she did find someone, he said, and somebody did come. So now you've got a different job, which is getting strong enough to prove that stubborn girl's faith was justified. Clara's lips twitch into something that might have been a smile if she'd had the strength for it. She gets the stubborn from her father. Jacob was the most hard-headed man in 3 territories. That's what Sarah said. Also said her mother wasn't far behind. This time the smile reached Clara's eyes, though it was shadowed by grief that clearly hadn't dulled much despite the months since her husband's death. I suppose we deserved each other. Elias poured water from the pitcher into the tin cup, then helped Clara sit up enough to drink. She took small sips, her hands shaking with the effort of holding the cup, even with his support. When she'd managed about half, he eased her back down, and she lay there breathing hard, as if that simple act had exhausted her completely. The doctor's coming back today, Elias said. Noon. He'll want to see you drinking water and keeping food down. Think you could manage some broth? I could try. Clara's eyes had already started to drift closed again, the brief conversation having depleted whatever reserves she'd scraped together. Mr. Thorne. Thank you for my daughter, for not riding past. Just Elias. And you already thanked me once, don't need to keep doing it. But Clara was already asleep again, her breathing deep and even, the kind of natural rest that healed, rather than the fever-driven unconsciousness that had gripped her before. Elias stood watching her for a moment. This woman who'd survived a Montana winter alone with a child, who'd kept going even when her neighbors gave up on her, who'd been prepared to face death rather than burden anyone with asking for help. He understood that mentality better than he wanted to admit. Sarah stirred on her pallet, rubbing her eyes and sitting up with the instant alertness of someone who'd learned to wake ready for crisis. Her gaze went immediately to her mother, then to Elias. Fear and hope mixing in her expression. She's better, Elias said before Sarah could ask. Woke up clear-headed a few minutes ago. Drank some water, talked for a bit. The fever's down considerably. The relief that washed over Sarah's face was so profound that Elias had to look away. Uncomfortable with the naked gratitude directed at him, she scrambled to her mother's bedside, taking Clara's hand gently, as if afraid too firm a grip might wake her. I knew she'd fight, Sarah whispered. I knew she wouldn't leave me. She's not out of the woods yet, Elias cautioned. Though he hated putting that careful note back into Sarah's expression. Doctor's coming back today. He'll be able to tell us more about how her recovery is going. But yes, this is good. This is real good. They fell into the rhythm that would define the next several days. Elias worked outside, repairing the lean-to's broken door, mending gaps in the cabin walls where wind had worked the chinking loose. Chopping wood to replenish the depleted stack, Sarah tended her mother with the fierce dedication of someone who, nearly lost everything and wasn't about to let it slip away now, and Clara slept. Woke, took her medicine, ate small amounts of broth and cornmeal mush, and slowly, incrementally, came back to herself. Dr. Sullivan arrived at noon as promised. Riding up to find Elias on the cabin roof, replacing a section of shingles that had blown loose sometime during the previous winter, the doctor dismounted and stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the scene with an expression that might have been approval. Playing handyman now, he called up. Seemed like it needed doing, Elias replied, hammering in another nail. The patient inside awake and lucid as of this morning. That's good news. Very good news, actually. Most pneumonia cases that present as severely as hers was either die within the first 72 hours or turn the corner by the 3rd day. If she's clear-headed, we're looking at the latter. Elias climbed down and followed the doctor inside, where Sarah immediately launched into a detailed report of every dose of medicine administered, every cup of water consumed, every moment of wakefulness, and what her mother had said. Dr. Sullivan listened with the patience of someone who understood that this recitation was as much for Sarah's benefit as his own. A way of proving she'd done everything right, that she hadn't failed in her duties. "You've done excellent work, Miss Sarah," the doctor said when she finally wound down. "Your mother is lucky to have such a capable nurse." He conducted his examination with the same thoroughness as before, listening to Clara's lungs, checking her pulse, examining her eyes and tongue. Clara bore the attention with quiet dignity, though Elias could see the effort it cost her to remain still and compliant, when everything in her nature probably wanted to insist she was fine and needed no further help. "The pneumonia is resolving," Dr. Sullivan announced finally. "Not quickly, mind you. You'll be weak for weeks, Mrs. Vance, possibly months, and you absolutely cannot overexert yourself or you risk relapse, which at this point could very well kill you. Do you understand?" "I understand," Clara said, though her tone suggested she understood, but didn't necessarily intend to comply. "But I've got a homestead to run, doctor. Chores don't wait for convenient recovery times." "Then I suppose it's fortunate you've got help." Dr. Sullivan glanced meaningfully at Elias. "Unless Mr. Thorne here is planning to abandon you immediately." All three of them looked at Elias, who found himself backed into a corner he'd been trying to avoid since Sarah first asked him to stay. He could leave. Nothing bound him here except a child's hope, and a woman's unspoken need, and his own inconvenient sense that walking away now would make him exact the kind of man he'd spent 3 years trying not to become. "I'll stay through harvest," he heard himself say. "Make sure the cabin's sound for winter. Get the heavy work done. After that we'll see." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Thorne, I told you I can't pay. And I told you I don't want your money." Elias's voice came out sharper than intended, frustration at his own capitulation bleeding through. "Consider it working off the doctor's fee, or whatever story lets you accept help without it killing your pride. But the fact is you need assistance, and I'm here. And I don't have anywhere more important to be. So that's how it is." Silence followed his words, heavy with things unsaid. Then Clara nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Through harvest," she agreed quietly. "And then we reassess." Dr. Sullivan cleared his throat, apparently satisfied that the adults had reached some kind of agreement. "Excellent. Now, Mrs. Vance, I'm adjusting your medication schedule. The fever tincture can be reduced to twice daily instead of 3 times. Continue the lung medicine as prescribed, and you need to eat real food, not just broth. Your body needs strength to heal, and you can't build strength on water and thin soup." He left additional instructions and another bottle of medicine, refusing payment with a brusque wave. "Consider it investment in future business. You stay alive, you'll probably need my services again eventually. Everybody out here does." After the doctor left, an awkward silence settled over the cabin. Elias busied himself with the fire, while Sarah fussed over her mother's pillows, and Clara lay propped up in bed, clearly wrestling with the reality of her situation. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah, sweetheart, could you fetch some water from the rain barrel? I'd like to wash my face." It was obviously a manufactured errand, a way to get the child outside so the adults could talk. Sarah glanced between them, then nodded and grabbed the bucket, closing the door quietly behind her. Clara waited until the sound of her daughter's footsteps faded before speaking. "You don't know me, Mr. Thorne. You don't owe me anything, so why would you stay?" Elias considered several answers, discarding each as too revealing or not true enough. Finally, he settled on honesty, or at least the closest he could come to it. 3 years ago, I had a wife. We lived in Missouri, had a small farm, barely scraping by, but making it work. She got pregnant, and I was so damn proud, so sure I was going to give my family everything they needed. He paused, the words harder to say than he'd expected, but I was also too proud to ask for help when we needed it. Too stubborn to admit when things were falling apart. When she went into labor early and things went wrong, I was 10 miles away trying to earn extra money instead of being home where I belonged. By the time I got back, I'd lost them both, my wife and the child I never got to meet. Clara's expression softened with recognition, the kind that came from knowing grief personally. "I'm sorry. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I understand what it's like to be too proud to accept help until it's too late. And I'm telling you because your daughter shouldn't have to lose her mother just because you inherited the same stubborn streak that cost me everything. He met her eyes steadily. So I'm staying not as charity, not as pity, but because maybe if I can help one family not fall apart. It means something. It means the last 3 years of running and hiding and pretending nothing matters weren't completely wasted. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers plucking at the quilt. When she spoke, her voice was thick. My husband built this cabin with his own hands. Every log, every nail. He had dreams for this place. Cattle, crops. Maybe building it up into something we could pass down to Sarah. And whatever other children came along. And then one moment of bad luck, and he was gone. And I've been holding on by my fingernails ever since, trying to honor what he built. Trying to prove I could manage alone, because admitting I couldn't felt like admitting he died for nothing. He didn't die for nothing, Elias said quietly. He left you and Sarah a home and a foundation. But foundations are meant to be built on, and sometimes that takes more than one person. Accepting help doesn't dishonor his memory. It means you're practical enough to recognize what you need to survive. The neighbors made their choices. I'm making mine. And for what it's worth, I suspect at least a few of them turned you away because they were ashamed they couldn't help more. Not because they didn't want to. Poverty breeds hard choices, and sometimes people protect their own guilt by pretending the person asking for help doesn't deserve it. Clara's laugh was short and bitter. You sound like you've given this a lot of thought. I've had 3 years to think about very little else. The door opened and Sarah returned with the water, her eyes immediately checking the emotional temperature of the room. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed, and she brought the bucket to her mother's bedside without the fearful tension she'd carried before. The afternoon passed in quiet productivity. Elias worked through a mental list of repairs he'd been compiling since his arrival. Securing loose boards, reinforcing the door hinges, checking the chimney for obstructions. Sarah read to her mother from a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, her young voice steady as she navigated the complicated prose. And Clara listened with her eyes closed, occasionally interjecting questions or comments that proved she was following along despite her exhaustion. It was domestic in a way that made Elias profoundly uncomfortable. This simulation of family life, this pretense of belonging, he deliberately avoided this kind of settled existence for 3 years, convinced that movement and solitude were safer than connections that could be broken. But as he worked, listening to Sarah's reading and Clara's responses, he found himself remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than just himself and his grief. He wasn't sure if that was progress, or just another kind of mistake waiting to happen. Evening came with the swift suddenness of early autumn, the sun dropping behind the western ridges and plunging the hollow into premature twilight. Elias brought Scout to the lean-to he'd repaired, and gave the buckskin a thorough grooming and a bucket of water. The horse had been remarkably patient with their extended stay, content to graze the sparse grass and stand hobbled during the day while Elias worked. "Sorry, boy," Elias murmured, running his hands over Scout's shoulders. "I know you're used to covering miles, not standing still. Just a bit longer." Scout huffed and lipped at Elias's shirt pocket, searching for treats that weren't there. The simple interaction, this uncomplicated relationship between man and horse, felt like the only pure thing in a situation that had become increasingly complex with each passing hour. Inside, Sarah had convinced her mother to eat some of the salt pork and cornbread left from earlier, and the sight of Clara sitting partially upright and feeding herself, even if every movement was slow and deliberate, felt like a small victory. Color had returned to her face, replacing the grayish pallor that had frightened Elias more than he had admitted. "Mr. Thorne," Clara said as he entered, "Sarah tells me you've been sleeping in the chair these past nights." "It's fine. I've slept in worse places. Nevertheless, it's not right. Jacob built a second bed frame before he died, thinking we'd need it eventually for more children. It's in pieces in the lean-to. If you wouldn't mind assembling it, at least you'd have something more comfortable than a chair." It was a peace offering. Elias recognized her way of acknowledging his presence and making space for it. "I'll do that after supper." They ate together, the 3 of them, and Elias was struck by how normal it felt despite everything. Just people sharing a meal, talking about small things. Sarah's attempt to keep the garden going, Clara's vague plans for winter preparation, Elias's observation that the lean-to could house a milk cow. if they could afford one. Ordinary conversations that presumed a future extending beyond the next crisis. After the dishes were cleaned and Sarah had administered the evening dose of medicine, Elias assembled the bed frame in the corner opposite Clara's. The pieces fit together with the precision of careful craftsmanship, each joint numbered, so there'd be no confusion about assembly. Jacob Vance had been a man who planned ahead, who built things meant to last. The realization made the bed feel somehow sacred, a connection to the man whose absence still shaped this family. Papa made that for when the baby came, Sarah said quietly, watching from her pallet. He was so excited. He kept talking about teaching his son to work wood, or his daughter, if that's what Mama had. He didn't care which. He just wanted. Her voice trailed off and she didn't finish the sentence. Elias tightened the final joint and spread his bedroll over the rope webbing that would support it. He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man, Sarah said fiercely. Everyone said so. Even the people who didn't like us very much said Papa was a good man who deserved better. Better than what? Better than dying, Sarah whispered. Better than leaving us alone. Clara's voice came from across the cabin, soft but firm. Your papa didn't choose to leave us, sweetheart. And he gave us everything he could while he was here. This cabin, this land, the love he showed us, that's all still here. Death doesn't take those things away. Elias finished with the bed and turned to find both Vance women watching him. With identical expressions, something between hope and uncertainty, as if they were waiting for him to confirm or deny Clara's statement. And he thought about the wife and child buried in Missouri, about the 3 years he'd spent running from their memory, about all the ways love persisted even after the people who gave it were gone. Your mother's right, he said to Sarah. The best parts of people stay with us. That's why we keep going. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in days, Elias stared at the dark ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Through harvest, he'd said. Maybe another month, 6 weeks at most. Enough time to make sure Clara was recovered, that the cabin was winterized, that the heavy work was done. Then he could leave with a clear conscience, knowing he'd fulfilled his obligation to the desperate child who'd asked for help. The plan was reasonable, practical, limited in scope and duration. It shouldn't have felt like a lie. But as he listened to Clara's steady breathing and Sarah's soft snores, as he felt the solid walls around him and smelled the lingering smoke from the banked fire, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he'd already stayed too long, let himself care too much, allowed these strangers to become something dangerously close to family, and the most terrifying part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to leave at all. The following week passed in a rhythm that began to feel inevitable. Each morning, Elias woke to find Sarah already up, tending the fire and checking on her mother. They'd eat breakfast together, usually cornmeal mush or the last of the salt pork, while Clara rested and regained strength. Then, Elias would spend the day working through the endless list of repairs and preparations the homestead needed, while Sarah divided her time between helping him and caring for her mother. Dr. Sullivan visited twice more, each time pronouncing Clara's recovery satisfactory, but emphasizing the need for continued rest. On his third visit, he pulled Elias aside outside the cabin. She's going to live, the doctor said without preamble. Barring complications or her own stubborn refusal to take care of herself, she'll make a full recovery. But it'll be slow, Mr. Thorne. Pneumonia weakens people in ways that aren't immediately visible. She'll tire easily for months. Heavy work will be beyond her capabilities until spring at the earliest. I understand. Do you? Dr. Sullivan's eyes were sharp. Because I'm telling you that this woman cannot manage this homestead alone this winter. If you're planning to leave, you need to make arrangements for someone else to help, or convince her to move into town, or accept that she and her daughter will likely not survive once the snows come. The blunt assessment settled over Elias like a physical weight. She won't leave this place. I suspected as much, which means you're committed to staying, whether you fully admitted it to yourself or not. The doctor picked up his bag and moved toward his horse. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. That girl needs stability, and her mother needs support. You're providing both. I don't know the first thing about working a homestead. Neither did Jacob Vance when he built this place. But he learned, and so will you. The question isn't whether you're capable, Mr. Thorne. The question is whether you're willing. Dr. Sullivan rode away, leaving Elias standing in the yard, wrestling with the truth of those words. Willing, such a simple concept. But it encompassed everything. The choice to stay, to commit, to let himself belong somewhere again despite knowing how badly belonging could hurt. He found Clara sitting up in bed, stronger now, able to manage short periods without help. She watched him enter with an expression that suggested she'd heard at least part of his conversation with the doctor. "He told you I need help through winter," she said. "It wasn't a question. He did. And you're reconsidering your promise to stay through harvest." Elias pulled out one of the chairs and sat, suddenly tired despite the morning hour. "I'm considering whether through harvest was ever a realistic timeline, or just something I told myself so I wouldn't have to admit I was making a longer commitment." Clara's hand smoothed the quilt with nervous energy. "I won't trap you here, Mr. Thorne. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. If you need to leave, Sarah and I will manage somehow. We always have. That's the problem, though, isn't it? You've been managing by your fingernails. One crisis away from catastrophe. And the only reason you're alive right now is because your daughter had enough courage to keep asking, until she found someone too stupid to say no." A ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips. "I wouldn't say stupid. Then what would you call a man who rides into a stranger's crisis and immediately volunteers to fix everything?" "I'd call him decent," Clara said quietly. "Maybe even kind. Certainly braver than most." The words settled uncomfortably. Too close to praise for Elias's liking. "I'm none of those things. I'm just a man who got tired of running and hasn't figured out what else to do. Sometimes that's enough." Clara shifted in bed, wincing slightly at the movement. Sarah's father used to say that life was mostly just showing up and doing the next right thing, and if you did that enough times in a row, eventually you'd build something worth having. Sounds like a wise man. He was, not formally educated, not sophisticated, but wise in the ways that mattered. Her expression turned distant, looking at something Elias couldn't see. "He'd like you, I think. He always respected people who followed through on their promises even when it cost them. I haven't promised anything beyond harvest, have I?" The question hung between them, and Elias found he had no good answer. Because Clara was right. Somewhere in the past week, his commitment had shifted, from temporary assistance to something that felt dangerously permanent. He'd started thinking about winter preparations, about what crops to plant come spring, about repairs that wouldn't be urgent until next year. Without consciously deciding, he'd begun to plan for a future that included this place and these people. "If I stay," he said carefully, "it needs to be clear what that means. I'm not replacing your husband. I'm not trying to take his place or fill the hole he left. I'm just—" He struggled for the right words. "I'm just helping. That's all. That's all I'm asking for," Clara said steadily, her gaze direct. "Help. Partnership, maybe friendship, if we can manage it. But nobody's asking you to be something you're not, or to pretend feelings you don't have. We're talking about survival, Mr. Thorne. Plain and simple. Can we survive winter better together than apart?" Put like that, the answer was obvious. "Yes." "Then I propose a practical arrangement. You stay through winter, help with the heavy work. Share the food and shelter. Come spring, if you want to move on, you do so with no hard feelings, and whatever payment I can scrape together for your labor. And if you want to stay longer, well," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "then we discuss what that would look like when we're not in crisis mode and thinking clearly." It was rational, businesslike. Exactly the kind of limited commitment Elias's self-preservation instincts demanded. No permanent obligations, no emotional entanglements. Just a practical agreement between adults trying to survive harsh circumstances. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something closer to disappointment, though he couldn't have said what he'd been hoping for instead. "Through winter, then," he agreed. "We'll see what comes after." They shook hands on it, Clara's grip surprisingly firm despite her weakness, and Elias tried to ignore the small voice whispering that he just made a promise he didn't entirely understand and wasn't sure he could keep. The agreement changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere, where before Elias had moved through the space with the careful neutrality of a temporary guest. Now he began to settle in with the unconscious ease of someone who belonged. He reorganized the woodpile for easier access during snow, relocated tools to more practical positions, and started making decisions about repairs without asking permission first. Clara watched these small territorial claims with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and grief, as if every improvement reminded her both of what she'd gained and what she'd lost. 2 weeks after their agreement, Clara was strong enough to sit at the table for meals and move around the cabin for short periods. though she tired quickly, and any exertion beyond the basics left her breathless. Sarah had relaxed considerably, the constant fear finally lifting from her thin shoulders now that her mother's recovery seemed assured. She'd even started laughing again, a sound that had been noticeably absent, and that transformed her entire face when it emerged. "Mr. Thorne," she said one morning while helping him repair a section of fence near the garden, "how come you know how to fix so many things?" Elias hammered in another nail, considering the question. "Picked it up here and there. When you work cattle drives and odd jobs across 6 territories, you learn what you need to survive. Can't always hire someone to fix your problems, so you figure out how to do it yourself. Did your papa teach you some?" "He was a wheelwright back in Ohio, so I grew up around tools and wood, but most of what I know came from watching other men work, and not being afraid to try things, even when I wasn't sure I'd get them right." Sarah tested the fence rail, nodding approvingly when it held firm. "Papa used to say that failure was just learning in disguise. He said you couldn't get good at anything without messing it up a few times first." "Your papa was right about that." Elias moved to the next broken section, Sarah trailing behind with the bag of nails. "What else did he teach you?" "Lots of things. How to read, how to figure numbers, how to tell which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick. He was teaching me to ride before he died. But we only had one horse and Mama sold her after to buy food for winter." Her voice dropped. "I miss riding. I miss feeling like I could go anywhere if I needed to." The longing in her words struck something in Elias's chest. He understood that yearning for freedom, that desire to have the option of leaving even if you never took it. It was part of why he'd spent 3 years drifting, convincing himself that movement equaled choice. "Tell you what," he said, straightening from his work, "Scout's gentle enough for a beginner. If you're interested, I could teach you to ride proper, not just sit a saddle, but really ride." Sarah's face lit up like sunrise. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it. We'll start this afternoon if your mama approves." They finished the fence work and returned to the cabin, to find Clara attempting to knead bread dough, her movements slow and clumsy. Frustration evident in every line of her body, she looked up when they entered, and Elias saw the sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "Let me do that," he said, crossing to the table and gently taking over. His hands found the rhythm easily, the push and fold motion, something he'd learned from his own mother years ago. "You're supposed to be resting, not wearing yourself out with heavy work." "I can't just lie in bed forever," Clara protested. But she sank into the chair with visible relief. "I need to pull my weight around here. You will when you're stronger. Right now, your job is to heal." Elias shaped the dough into a rough ball and set it in the bowl to rise. "Besides, Sarah and I make a decent team. We've got things covered." "That's what worries me," Clara said quietly, "you two getting comfortable with me being useless." Sarah moved to her mother's side immediately. "You're not useless, Mama. You're sick. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm sitting, Mr. Thorne has taken over running my household, and I've become nothing but an invalid who can't even make bread without collapsing." The bitterness in her voice made Elias pause. He'd been so focused on practical matters, on keeping the homestead functioning and preparing for winter, that he hadn't considered how his competence might feel like criticism to a woman who'd been fighting for independence since her husband's death. "Mrs. Vance," he said, wiping flour from his hands and turning to face her directly, "you spent months keeping this place going alone while grieving your husband and raising a child. You survived a winter that would have broken most people, and when sickness nearly killed you, you still managed to raise a daughter brave enough to keep searching for help until she found it. None of that is useless. None of that disappears just because you need assistance right now." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It feels like failure. It feels like being human. We all need help sometimes. The strong thing is accepting it, not pretending you don't need it until it's too late." The words hung in the air, and Elias realized he was preaching wisdom. He'd never managed to practice himself. He'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of interdependence, convinced that needing nothing from anyone was the same as being strong. But sitting here in this cabin, watching a woman struggle with the same pride that had cost him everything, he began to understand that maybe strength looked different than he'd thought. "Mr. Thorne asked if he could teach me to ride," Sarah interjected, clearly trying to shift the mood. "I said I had to ask you first." Clara looked between them, and slowly her expression softened. "Your father would have liked that. He always said everyone should know how to ride. Is that a yes?" Sarah's hope was almost painful in its intensity. "That's a yes. But you listen to Mr. Thorne's instructions, and you don't take foolish risks just to show off. I won't. I promise. That afternoon, Elias saddled Scout in the lean-to, while Sarah practically vibrated with excitement beside him. The buckskin seemed to sense her energy and stood perfectly still, ears forward but body relaxed in the way of horses who understood their job. First rule, Elias said as he checked the cinch one final time. The horse is bigger and stronger than you, but you're smarter. Your job is to communicate clearly what you want, and to listen to what the horse is telling you back. Riding isn't about domination, it's about partnership. He spent an hour teaching her the basics, walking beside Scout while Sarah learned to feel the horse's movement beneath her, to move with it rather than fighting against it. She was a natural, her body finding the rhythm instinctively, her hands gentle on the reins. By the time the lesson ended, she was beaming with pride, and Scout was looking pleased with himself in the way horses did when they'd been good. Can we do this every day? Sarah asked as Elias lifted her down. Every day the weather permits, and once you've got the basics solid, we'll work on more advanced skills. By spring, you'll be riding well enough to help with real work. You really think so? I know so. You've got good instincts, and you're not afraid. Those are the two most important things. Clara was standing in the doorway watching, and when their eyes met, Elias saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not quite gratitude. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of both. It terrified him more than he wanted to admit. This slow accumulation of connection, this gradual erosion of the walls he'd built around himself. The days shortened as autumn deepened into its final phase before winter. Elias worked with increasing urgency, knowing that once the snows came, certain repairs would become impossible. He reinforced the cabin's foundation, replaced rotted wood in the lean-to, and spent 2 full days on the roof, making sure every shingle was secure and every potential leak sealed. Clara grew stronger incrementally, able to work for an hour at a time before needing to rest, her determination to regain independence both admirable and concerning. One evening, as they sat around the table after supper, Clara pulled out a worn ledger and opened it to a page covered in careful figures. I've been doing calculations, she said without preamble. Winter supplies, what we have versus what we need. It's not good. Elias leaned over to look at the numbers. She'd listed everything: flour, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, dried beans, salt pork. The quantities on hand were pitifully small. The quantities needed significantly larger. How much money do we have to work with? He asked. The we slipping out naturally, $17. The 3 I'd saved, plus what I got from selling some of Jacob's tools to the blacksmith in town. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. It's not enough, not nearly enough to buy what we need, and still have anything left for emergencies. Sarah looked between them, fear creeping back into her expression. Are we going to starve? No, Elias said firmly, though he was already running calculations in his own head. We're not going to starve, but we need to be smart about this. He studied the list again, his mind working through possibilities. The garden still has some late vegetables we can harvest and store. And there's game in these hills. Deer, rabbit, maybe even elk if we're lucky. I can hunt, lay in meat for winter. That'll stretch the money further. Do you know how to preserve meat? Clara asked. I've seen it done. Salt cure, smoke, dry it into jerky. I can figure it out. I know how, Clara said quietly. Jacob and I did it every year. I can teach you and Sarah can help. It'll give me something useful to do. Over the next week, they fell into a new rhythm organized around preparation and preservation. Elias borrowed a rifle from Dr. Sullivan, promising to repay him in labor come spring, and spent his mornings hunting the ridges above the hollow. He brought down 2 deer and countless rabbits, and each evening they worked together processing the meat, Clara directing, while Sarah and Elias did the physical labor. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and curing meat, and something shifted in their dynamic during those shared tasks. They talked while they worked, not about anything important, but about small things, memories of better times, observations about the weather, stories from their different pasts. Elias found himself speaking about his life before Missouri, about his childhood in Ohio, and the various territories he drifted through. Clara shared memories of her and Jacob's early years when they'd been young and hopeful and certain they could build something lasting. We met in Independence, she said one evening, while rubbing salt into strips of venison. I was there with my father buying supplies for his dry goods store back in Illinois. Jacob was passing through, heading west to find land and opportunity. We talked for maybe 20 minutes at the general store, and I knew. She smiled at the memory. I just knew he was going to be important. What did your father think about you running off with a stranger heading west? Elias asked. He was furious. Said I was throwing away my life, that I'd end up widowed and destitute in some godforsaken territory. Her smile turned sad. He wasn't entirely wrong, as it turned out. But you don't regret it? Not for a moment. The years I had with Jacob, the life we built, the daughter we made. Those were worth every hardship that came after. She paused in her work, looking at Sarah, who was carefully arranging strips of meat on the smoking rack. Sometimes the best things in life require the biggest risks. The words seemed aimed at more than just her own history, and Elias felt the weight of implication, but chose not to examine it too closely. Instead, he focused on the work, on the practical steps required to ensure their survival, on the comfortable silence that fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Sarah's occasional questions. By mid-October, they'd laid in a reasonable store of preserved meat and harvested the last of the garden's yield. Elias built crude shelves in the coolest corner of the cabin to store root vegetables and created a cupboard to outside for additional storage. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. They'd make it through winter if they were careful, and if luck held. The first snow came early one morning, surprising them with its suddenness. Elias woke to find the world outside transformed, the hollow covered in a blanket of white that softened every hard edge, and made the familiar landscape strange and beautiful. Sarah's delighted cry when she saw it brought both adults to the window, and they stood watching as fat flakes continued to fall, accumulating in drifts against the cabin walls. I love the first snow, Sarah said, her breath fogging the glass. Papa always said it was the land putting on its winter blanket, getting ready for the long sleep. Your papa had a way with words, Elias observed. He did. Mama says I take after him that way. She turned from the window, her expression suddenly serious. Mr. Thorne? Are you glad you stayed? Or do you wish you'd kept riding that day I found you? The question caught him off guard with its directness. Clara was watching from the table where she'd been mending a shirt. Her needle paused mid-stitch, clearly as interested in his answer as her daughter. Elias considered lying, offering some platitude about being happy to help or doing what needed to be done, but these two had earned honesty from him, even when honesty was uncomfortable. I don't know yet, he said fondly. Some days I wake up and wonder what I've gotten myself into, how I went from passing stranger to someone building shelves and hunting deer and teaching a little girl to ride. It's not what I planned. It's not what I thought I wanted. Sarah's face fell slightly, but Elias continued. But then there are moments, usually small ones, like when we're working together and everything just flows, or when I see your mama laughing again, or when you land a perfect transition on Scout, and in those moments, I think, maybe staying was the smartest thing I've done in 3 years, maybe the only smart thing. So you are glad? Sarah pressed, needing certainty. I'm getting there, Elias said, which was as close to the truth as he could manage, still figuring it out, but I'm getting there. The answer seemed to satisfy her, and she returned her attention to the falling snow. Already planning all the things they could do once enough accumulated, Clara met Elias's eyes across the cabin and nodded slightly, a gesture of understanding that needed no words. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, and Clara was dozing in her bed, Elias sat by the fire and allowed himself to think about the future for the first time in years, not in terms of escape routes or exit strategies, but in terms of possibility, spring planning, expanding the garden, maybe buying a cow or some chickens, small ambitions, domestic ones, the kind he'd fled from after losing everything in Missouri. The difference, he realized, was that this time he wasn't building something alone. Whatever happened in this cabin, whatever they created together, it would be shared work, shared risk, shared reward. He wouldn't have to carry the burden of providing for a family by himself, while his pride prevented him from asking for help when he needed it. Clara and Sarah were partners in survival, not dependents waiting to be rescued. That distinction mattered more than he'd understood until now. The winter settled in with a kind of cold that made every breath visible, and every movement outside a calculated decision about necessity versus comfort. They burned through wood at a steady rate, and Elias found himself grateful for the hours he'd spent in autumn, chopping and stacking, building reserves that now seemed barely adequate. The days fell into a rhythm defined by survival's demands: tend the fire, check on Scout, prepare meals, maintain the cabin. and fill the long, dark evenings with whatever activities could push back the isolation. Clara taught Sarah arithmetic using dried beans as counters, while Elias worked on repairing harnesses and mending clothes, with stitches that would have made his mother weep but served their purpose. They told stories, played simple word games, and occasionally just sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts while the wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls during a particular fierce storm that kept them cabin-bound for 3 days straight. Clara pulled out the worn copy of Robinson Crusoe and suggested they take turns reading aloud. It became their evening ritual, gathering close to the fire while one person read and the others listened. The story of a man surviving alone on an island resonating perhaps more than it should have. "Do you think he was lonely?" Sarah asked one night during a break in the reading. "Even with Friday there, do you think he missed having more people around?" "I think loneliness isn't always about how many people are present," Clara said thoughtfully. "Sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. And sometimes 1 or 2 people who really understand you is more than enough." Her eyes met Elias's briefly, and he wondered if she was still talking about Crusoe, or if the conversation had shifted to something more immediate, more personal. He thought about the years he'd spent drifting, surrounded by people in trail camps and saloons and cattle drives, yet carrying his grief like a stone that separated him from every human connection. Then he thought about this cabin, these 2 people, and realized that somewhere in the past months he'd stopped feeling quite so alone. "I think," Elias said slowly, "that Crusoe had to learn that surviving wasn't the same as living, that maybe the island wasn't his prison. His refusal to accept help and build real connections was." Clara's expression suggested she heard what he wasn't quite saying directly, and her small smile felt like acknowledgement of growth he hadn't been sure she'd noticed. December brought even colder temperatures, and a Christmas that all 3 of them approached with carefully managed expectations. They had no money for gifts, no traditional feast, no decorations beyond some pine boughs Sarah arranged on the mantel, but Clara used precious flour and sugar to make simple cookies, and Elias carved a small wooden horse for Sarah that took him weeks of evening work to complete. Sarah presented them each with drawings she'd made secretly, portraits that showed surprising skill for a child her age. Clara by the fire, Elias working outside, the 3 of them at the table together. "It's us," Sarah said unnecessarily, watching their faces anxiously. "Our family." The word hung in the air, weighted with implications none of them had explicitly discussed. Elias looked at the drawing, 3 figures clearly identifiable, clearly together, and felt something shift in his chest, some final wall crumbling that he'd been maintaining through sheer stubborn will. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "Thank you." That night, long after the celebration had ended and everyone had settled for sleep, Elias lay awake thinking about that word. Family. He'd lost his family in Missouri, spent 3 years convinced he'd never have another one, never wanted another one. But here he was in a cabin in Montana with a widow and her daughter, and somehow without his permission or planning they become exactly that. A family. Not the one he'd imagined in his youth, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something new and unexpected and terrifyingly precious. The realization should have sent him running for a scout in the trail. Instead, it settled over him like one of Clara's quilts, warm and substantial, and exactly what he needed even if he hadn't known he needed it. January arrived with temperatures that made October's cold seem mild by comparison. They burned through their wood stores faster than Elias liked, and he found himself making dangerous trips outside during brief breaks in the weather to chop more, always aware that a sudden storm could trap him away from the cabin, or that a wrong step in deep snow could mean injury, with no doctor available until spring. During one of these excursions, the axe handle cracked on a particularly hard swing, splitting almost completely through. Elias stared at it with rising concern. They couldn't afford a new handle, and without an axe, they couldn't cut wood, and without wood, they'd freeze. The mathematics of frontier survival were brutally simple. He returned to the cabin with the broken tool and showed it to Clara, who examined the damage with the same assessing look her husband had probably worn when facing similar crises. "Jacob had a spare handle in the lean-to," she said finally. "He always kept spares of critical tools. Check the back corner. There's a bundle of long handles he'd shaped but never finished." Elias found them exactly where she said, covered in dust and cobwebs, but perfectly serviceable. As he fitted the new handle and secured it, he felt a strange gratitude toward the dead man whose foresight was still protecting his family months after his death. Jacob Vance had thought ahead, planned for contingencies, built reserves against disaster. These were the actions of a man who understood that survival wasn't about strength, but about preparation and persistence. Elias had spent 3 years just surviving day to day, moving before problems could accumulate, avoiding commitment because commitment meant vulnerability. But Jacob had chosen the harder path, planting roots, building something that could outlast him, creating a legacy in wood and stone in the family he'd loved, looking around the cabin with its solid walls and careful craftsmanship. Elias began to understand which approach actually required more courage. By late January, something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. Clara had regained most of her strength, though she still tired more easily than before her illness. She'd taken back much of the household management, working alongside Elias rather than watching from the sidelines. And somewhere in the long winter evenings, the careful distance they'd maintained began to dissolve. It started with small things. Clara's hand on Elias's shoulder as she passed behind his chair. Elias automatically pouring her coffee without being asked. The way they developed a dozen small routines that spoke of familiarity and trust. Sarah watched these developments with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly pleased that the two adults were finding their way towards something that felt less like a business arrangement and more like genuine partnership. One evening, while Sarah was absorbed in her reading by the fire, Clara and Elias sat at the table working on plans for spring planting. Their heads were close together over the rough sketches, and Elias was acutely aware of her proximity. The smell of soap and wood smoke that clung to her hair, the way her shoulder brushed his when she leaned forward to point at something on the paper. "We should expand the garden here," she said, indicating the southern edge. "More sun exposure, better drainage." Jacob always meant to, but never got around to it. "Makes sense. And if we do well enough with crops, we might have surplus to trade in town for things we can't grow or make ourselves." "That's ambitious. I like it." Clara looked up and suddenly they were very close. Her face maybe 6 inches from his, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Neither moved for a long moment. And Elias felt the air between them charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Clara pulled back slightly, clearing her throat. "We should probably think about seeds soon before the demand drives prices up." "Right. Seeds." Elias forced himself to focus on the practical matter at hand, even as his pulse continued racing. "I could ride into Cedar Creek next week if the weather holds. See what they've got available." They returned to planning, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been approached, if not quite crossed, and later, lying in his bed in the dark, Elias found himself thinking not about spring planting, but about the possibility of futures that extended beyond mere survival. Futures that might include not just partnership, but something deeper, something that terrified and attracted him in equal measure. He'd come to this cabin 6 months ago to help a desperate child and her dying mother, never intending to stay, never imagining he'd find himself here, building a life he'd thought was lost to him forever. But intentions didn't matter much in the face of reality. And the reality was that he'd stopped thinking of this as temporary accommodation and started thinking of it as home. The question that kept him awake wasn't whether to stay anymore. That decision had been made and remade 100 times over the winter, through actions rather than words. The question now was what staying meant, and whether he had the courage to risk his heart again after spending 3 years protecting it. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters with the familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to their winter. But inside the cabin, warmth and lamplight held back the darkness. Elias couldn't sleep, his mind turning over the moment at the table earlier, the way Clara had looked at him, the electricity that had passed between them in that brief space before common sense reasserted itself. He told himself it was foolish to read too much into a glance, dangerous to let hope kindle, when he'd learned so painfully what happened when you built dreams on uncertain foundations. But the heart, he was discovering, didn't much care about lessons learned or walls constructed. It just kept reaching toward connection. Despite every rational argument against it, morning came cold and clear, the kind of day that promised brutal temperatures, but at least offered visibility and the possibility of getting necessary work done. Elias was feeding Scout when Clara appeared in the lean-to doorway, wrapped in Jacob's old coat that still hung too large on her frame. "I wanted to talk to you," she said without preamble, without Sarah listening. Elias set down the feed bucket, his stomach tightening. "All right." Clara moved closer, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "Last night at the table, that moment, I need to know if I imagined it, or if you felt it too." The directness caught him off guard. He'd expected avoidance, polite pretense that nothing had happened. Instead, she was confronting it head-on with the same practical courage she brought to every other challenge. "You didn't imagine it," he said quietly. "Good. Because I've been going slowly crazy thinking maybe I was projecting. Seeing things that weren't there because I'm lonely and grateful and you've been so good to us." She pulled the coat tighter around herself. "But if you felt it too, then we need to talk about what happens next. Do we? Can't we just?" He trailed off, realizing he didn't have an ending to that sentence. Just what? Ignore it? Pretend? He'd tried that approach before, and it hadn't worked. "I loved my husband," Clara said firmly. "I loved him with everything I had, and losing him nearly destroyed me. For months after he died, I couldn't imagine ever feeling that way about anyone else. It seemed impossible, disloyal somehow." "Clara, let me finish." She held up a hand. "But these past months with you, I've learned something. Love isn't a finite resource. The love I had for Jacob doesn't disappear just because I'm capable of feeling something for someone else. And Jacob would never have wanted me to spend the rest of my life alone, just to prove I'd loved him enough." Elias's throat felt tight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between you arriving here as a stranger and now, you became essential. Not just because you work hard or because you've kept us alive through winter, but because you listen when I talk. Because you treat Sarah like she matters. Because you're patient with my pride and my grief and my stubborn refusal to accept help, even when I desperately need it." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm saying I have feelings for you, Elias Thorne, and I needed you to know that before another day passed with us dancing around it and pretending otherwise." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Elias thought he understood about their arrangement. He told himself he was here out of obligation, out of debt to a child who'd asked for help, but standing in this lean-to with Clara, looking at him like he was something precious and unexpected. He had to confront the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. "I'm terrified," he said finally, "of caring that much again. Of building something and then watching it fall apart. I already failed one family, Clara. What if I fail yours too?" "You won't. You can't know that." "No, I can't, but I do know that you're already here, already part of this family, whether you've admitted it or not. The question isn't whether you'll fail us. The question is whether you'll let fear keep you from having something real just because there's a chance it might hurt." Elias thought about his wife, about the guilt he'd carried for 3 years, about all the ways he'd convinced himself that staying distant was safer than risking connection. And he thought about Sarah's drawings, about winter evenings by the fire, about the accumulation of small moments that had rebuilt something inside him he thought was permanently broken. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at being vulnerable, at trusting that good things can last. Then we'll learn together, because I'm not particularly good at it either anymore." Clara moved closer, close enough that he could see the hope and fear mixing in her expression. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try, don't you?" Before he could answer, before he could overthink and second-guess and retreat into the comfortable safety of isolation, Elias closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was awkward at first, hesitant, both of them out of practice and uncertain. But then Clara's hands came up to frame his face, and something shifted, the kiss deepening into something that felt like promise and possibility and the beginning of healing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara was smiling. "So, I'm taking that as a yes." "That's a yes," Elias confirmed, and felt something in his chest ease. Some burden he'd been carrying finally set down. They returned to the cabin to find Sarah watching them with knowing eyes, and a satisfied expression that suggested she'd orchestrated this outcome through sheer force of will. Finally, she said, "I was starting to think you two would never figure it out." "Figure what out?" Clara asked, trying for innocent and failing completely. "That you like each other. That Mr. Thorne should stay forever, not just through winter. That we're supposed to be a real family." Sarah crossed her arms with 7-year-old certainty. "It was pretty obvious to everyone except you two." Elias and Clara exchanged glances, caught between amusement and chagrin at being so transparent to a child. "Nothing's decided yet," Clara cautioned. "This is all very new and complicated." "It's not complicated," Sarah said with the directness of youth. "Do you love him?" Clara's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away from her daughter. "I think I could. I think I'm already starting to. And Mr. Thorne, do you love Mama?" Elias felt 3 pairs of eyes on him, Clara's carefully neutral, Sarah's expectant, and even Scout's seeming to peer through the lean-to wall with judgment. Love felt like too big a word, too weighted with history and failure. But as he stood there searching for the right answer, he realized that what he felt was already more than he'd allowed himself to feel in 3 years. "I care about your mother very much," he said carefully, "and about you. This family has come to mean more to me than I knew how to admit until recently. So, if what you're asking is whether I plan to stay and see where this goes, then yes, I'm staying." Sarah launched herself at him with enough force to nearly knock him over, her thin arms wrapping around his waist in a fierce hug. "I knew it. I knew you wouldn't leave us." Over her head, Elias met Clara's eyes and saw his own wonder reflected back at him. They'd both thought their chances at happiness were finished, that the best they could hope for was survival and perhaps peace. But standing here in this cabin, with winter still howling outside and spring months away, they'd found something neither expected: the possibility of beginning again. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation as winter gradually loosened its grip. Elias made the trip to Cedar Creek for seeds and supplies, returning with news that made Clara's eyes light up with possibilities. The general store owner, hearing about their situation, had offered credit for spring supplies against the promise of crops in autumn. It was a risk, but it was also opportunity, the chance to expand beyond mere subsistence into something that might actually prosper. "We could plant wheat," Clara said, studying the seed packets like they contained treasure, "and maybe some cash crops, tobacco or hops, if we can manage it." Jacob always wanted to try hops, said there was good money in it with all the breweries out west. They planned late into the evenings, Sarah contributing ideas with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who finally felt secure enough to think about the future. They argued good-naturedly about crop rotation and debated whether to invest in chickens or save for a cow. And through it all, the tension that had defined their early months together dissolved into something that felt remarkably like joy. Dr. Sullivan visited in early March, ostensibly to check on Clara's continued recovery. But really, Elias suspected, out of curiosity about how their unusual household had fared through winter. He examined Clara with professional thoroughness, then declared her completely recovered, with the caveat that she needed to avoid overexertion for another few months. "You've done well," he told them both as he prepared to leave. "Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. Most makeshift arrangements like this fall apart under the strain of a Montana winter. The fact that you three are still together and apparently thriving says something about your respective characters." "We got lucky," Clara said. "Luck had very little to do with it." The doctor swung into his saddle and looked down at them with something approaching fondness. "You chose each other, and you kept choosing each other when it would have been easier to quit. That's not luck. That's commitment. And commitment is what builds futures worth having." After he left, Clara turned to Elias with a question in her eyes. "Are we building a future worth having?" "I think we are," Elias said. "Or at least we're trying to, Isn't that what matters?" Spring came suddenly, as it often did in Montana, the snow melting in rushing torrents that turned the hollow into a temporary lake before draining away to reveal the muddy earth beneath. They worked from dawn to dusk, turning soil, planting seeds, repairing winter damage to the cabin and outbuildings. Elias built raised beds for the garden expansion and constructed a proper chicken coop from scavenged lumber. Clara sewed curtains from flour sacks and made plans for preserving what she hoped would be an abundant harvest. And Sarah, growing confident in the saddle, began taking on real responsibilities, riding to the Bensons to borrow tools, checking fence lines for damage, helping herd scout when he got loose and decided to explore. She was becoming less a frightened child and more a capable young person, and both adults took quiet pride in her transformation. One evening in late April, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of crimson and gold, Sarah asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for weeks. "Mr. Thorne, are you going to marry Mama?" Clara choked on her coffee while Elias froze mid-motion. Both of them caught completely off guard by the child's directness. When he could speak, Elias said carefully, "That's a complicated question, Sarah. Why? You love her, she loves you. We're already a family. Seems pretty simple to me." "Marriage is a serious commitment," Clara said, finding her voice. "It's not something to rush into just because it seems convenient or logical." "But you do want to marry him, don't you?" Sarah pressed with the relentless logic of youth. "Or are you just going to live together forever without making it official? Because people in town are already talking, and Mrs. Benson told me at church that it wasn't proper for a man and woman to share a household without being married unless they're family." Elias and Clara exchanged glances over Sarah's head. They'd been so focused on getting through each day on building trust and allowing feelings to develop naturally. That neither had wanted to rush toward formal commitments that might jinx their fragile new beginning. But Sarah was right. They couldn't exist in this liminal space forever, not without consequences for all of them. Would you want that? Elias asked Clara quietly. Marriage? I mean, making this permanent and official. Clara took a long moment before answering, her eyes distant as she seemed to consult with ghosts only she could see. Then she turned to face him fully, her expression clear and certain. Yes, she said simply, I would want that, not because the town expects it or because it's the proper thing, but because I love you, and I want to build a real life with you, and I want Sarah to grow up in a household where commitment means something. Elias's heart was pounding so hard he was sure both of them could hear it. This was the moment he'd been both hoping for and dreading. The point where running was no longer an option, and he had to decide whether he trusted himself enough to try again. He thought about his first wife, about the ways his pride and fear had destroyed what they'd built. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent drifting, convinced he'd used up his chance at family. And he thought about this cabin, these two people, and the man he'd slowly become under their influence. Someone stronger and braver and more capable of love than the broken drifter who'd stopped because a child asked him to. I don't have a ring, he said, which wasn't an answer but also was, and I'm still figuring out how to be the kind of man who deserves a second chance. But if you'll have me, if you'll both have me, then yes, I want to marry you, Clara Vance. I want to make this official and permanent and real. Sarah whooped with delight loud enough to startle birds from nearby trees. Clara was crying and smiling simultaneously, and when Elias pulled her close, she melted into him with the kind of trust that felt like the most precious gift he'd ever received. We'll do it properly, Clara said when she could speak. In town. With witnesses. So everyone knows this is real. So there's no question about our commitment or your place in this family. They married 3 weeks later in Cedar Creek's small church, with Dr. Sullivan standing as witness and Sarah serving as the world's proudest attendant. Clara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric bought with egg money, and Elias wore his cleanest shirt and borrowed a tie from the blacksmith. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, but when they stood before the circuit preacher and spoke their vows, the weight of the moment felt as real and binding as any ceremony in the grandest cathedral. I promise to stand beside you, Elias said when it was his turn, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. In good times and hard times. In prosperity and want. I promise to listen when you need to be heard, and to ask for help when I need it. I promise to honor your strength and to remember always that we're partners in this life. Not savior and saved, but two people building something together. Clara's vows echoed his own commitment, promising partnership and honesty and the courage to keep choosing each other, even when it was difficult. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like forgiveness and hope, and the beginning of a story neither had thought they'd get to write. The townspeople who'd heard about the wedding, which turned out to be more than expected, had organized a modest celebration at the hotel. The Bensons were there, looking somewhat ashamed as they congratulated the couple and promised to be better neighbors going forward. The Harpers brought a wedding cake they'd baked, apologizing for their earlier coldness. Even the general store owner, who'd extended them credit, made an appearance, clearly pleased that his investment was looking more secure with every passing day. You gave people a second chance, Dr. Sullivan observed quietly as they watched the modest festivities. By succeeding where they expected you to fail, you made them examine their own choices. That's a powerful thing. I just did what needed doing, Elias said. Exactly. That's what most people fail to do. The obvious right thing. The necessary thing. They get caught up in complications and justifications and protecting themselves from risk. You and Clara chose differently. And now look at what you've built. What they'd built, Elias reflected, was more than just a functioning household or a plan for financial survival. They'd built trust where there had been only fear, family where there had been strangers, hope where there had been only grief. It wasn't perfect or easy, and he knew they'd face challenges ahead. Crops could fail, illness could return, the Montana climate could deliver any number of hardships. But they'd face those challenges together with the kind of partnership that made burdens lighter and joys deeper. That night, after returning to the cabin and tucking an exhausted but happy Sarah into bed, Elias and Clara stood outside looking at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. The land around them was dark and quiet, but inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming, a beacon against the darkness. Do you ever think about that day? Clara asked. When Sarah found you on the trail. All the time, Elias admitted. I think about how close I came to riding past, to staying committed to being alone. 5 more minutes down the trail, and I would have been too far away to hear her crying. My entire life would be completely different. Mine, too. We'd probably both be dead if you'd kept riding. Me from pneumonia. Sarah from trying to survive alone through winter. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. It's strange how one small decision can change everything. Maybe it wasn't that small, Elias said thoughtfully. Maybe it was actually the biggest decision either of us ever made. You choosing to let a stranger help. Me choosing to stop running. Maybe those moments that feel small at the time are actually the hinges everything else swings on. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. And Elias marveled at how right this felt, how natural it seemed to be standing here with his wife, planning their shared future. The grief he'd carried for 3 years hadn't disappeared completely, but it had transformed into something gentler, a memory of love rather than a burden of guilt. He could think about his first wife and their child without the crushing weight of failure, could honor what they'd meant to him while still embracing this new life he'd stumbled into. What are you thinking? Clara asked. I'm thinking that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept that they deserve a second chance, that past failures don't have to define future possibilities. He turned to face her, cupping her face gently in his hands. I'm thinking that I love you, Clara Thorne, and I'm grateful every day that your daughter was stubborn enough to keep asking until she found help. Me too, Clara whispered. And for what it's worth, I think you're exactly the man we needed. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and present and willing to try. That's more than most people offer. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and endless work, but it was work that felt purposeful rather than desperate. Their crops grew strong and healthy. The garden overflowed with vegetables, and the chicken coop Elias had built filled with hens that provided eggs for eating and selling. They fell into rhythms that felt both ancient and new. Rising with the sun, working side by side through the long days, falling into bed exhausted, but satisfied. Sarah flourished under the stability, growing taller and more confident with each passing week. She could ride Scout independently now, handle chores with minimal supervision, and read at a level that impressed even the school teacher when they enrolled her in the fall term. She'd stopped introducing Elias as Mr. Thorne, and started calling him Pa, without anyone suggesting she should, a shift that made Elias's throat tight every single time. By harvest time, they had enough surplus wheat to sell in Cedar Creek, and enough preserved vegetables to see them through 2 winters. The general store owner pronounced himself extremely satisfied with their success, and immediately extended credit for the following year. Neighbors who'd been standoffish began stopping by to ask advice about crops, or to offer help with larger projects. The Vance Thorne homestead was becoming a fixture in the community, and by extension, so were its inhabitants. One October evening, almost exactly a year after Elias had first arrived, they held a small celebration to mark the occasion. Dr. Sullivan came, along with the Bensons and Harpers and several other families who'd gradually become friends rather than distant neighbors. They ate roasted chicken and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden, and when someone asked Elias to tell the story of how he'd come to be there, he found himself narrating the tale with Clara and Sarah, filling in details he'd forgotten or never known. And that's when I knew, Sarah said at the story's climax, that P was going to stay forever. Because he came back when he said he would, and he kept every promise he made. And that's what family does. The gathering fell quiet at her words, everyone recognizing the simple truth in them. Family at its core was about showing up, and keeping promises, and choosing each other over and over again. It didn't require blood relation or legal ties, though those could help. It just required commitment and presence, and the courage to be vulnerable with other people. After the guests had left and Sarah had fallen asleep, Elias and Clara sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. This had become their ritual, this quiet time together at day's end, when they could simply exist without demands or responsibilities pressing on them. I have something to tell you, Clara said, and something in her tone made Elias turn to look at her carefully. She was smiling, but there was nervousness underneath it, an uncertainty that made his heart skip. What is it? I'm pregnant, she said softly, about 3 months along. The doctor thinks. He confirmed it when he was here checking on the Benson's baby last week. The world seemed to stop for a moment, all sound and sensation narrowing to those 3 words and what they meant. A baby, a child. Another chance at the family Elias had thought was lost forever. His throat closed up completely, tears burning behind his eyes. "Elias." Clara's voice held worry now. "Say something. Is this all right? I know we didn't plan for this so soon, but—" He pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in existence, which she was. "It's more than all right," he managed to say past the emotion clogging his throat. "It's everything. It's proof that second chances are real. That we really did build something worth having." Clara relaxed against him, her own tears falling now. "I was so scared you'd think it was too soon. That you weren't ready." "I'm terrified," Elias admitted, "absolutely terrified. But I'm also happier than I can remember being, and I'm ready to try again. To do it right this time. With a partner who won't let me carry everything alone, who will make me ask for help when I need it." They sat holding each other as the stars multiplied overhead, and the night sounds of the Montana frontier played their familiar symphony around them. Inside the cabin, Sarah slept peacefully, and in Clara's belly, a new life grew. Testament to their courage in choosing hope over fear, connection over isolation, future over past. "Tell me something," Clara said after a while. "That day on the trail, when you heard Sarah crying, what made you stop? What was different about that moment?" Elias thought back to the afternoon that felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. He remembered the wariness, the instinct to keep moving, the voice in his head telling him that involvement meant complication, and he remembered the moment when all of that fell away and he'd chosen differently. "I think I was just tired enough of running that when an opportunity to stop presented itself, I took it. Not because I was particularly brave or virtuous, but because some part of me recognized that a life spent avoiding pain is also a life spent avoiding everything else that makes living worthwhile." He paused, searching for the right words. Sarah asked for help. "And for once, I didn't calculate the cost before deciding. I just helped. And that one moment of not overthinking, of just responding to genuine need with genuine care, that changed everything." "I'm glad you stopped overthinking," Clara said softly. "Me, too. Best decision I never quite made consciously." Spring came again, and with it the birth of their son, a healthy, squalling baby they named Jacob, after Clara's first husband, because Elias insisted that honoring the man who'd built their foundation was important. Sarah was enchanted with her baby brother, taking to her new role as older sister with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything else. The homestead continued to prosper. They added a milk cow and expanded the chicken flock, built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and began to establish themselves as fixtures in the Cedar Creek community. Elias took on occasional work for neighbors, his reputation for reliability and skill spreading gradually through the territory. Clara's garden became locally famous, and she began selling preserves and dried herbs at the general store. But more than the external markers of success, what mattered was the life they'd built within the cabin walls, the evening meals around the table, the stories told by lamplight, the laughter and occasional arguments and reconciliations that comprised the daily texture of family life. They weren't perfect, and they had their struggles like any family, but they faced those struggles together with the kind of partnership that made all the difference. Years later, when people asked Elias about his life and how he'd ended up in Montana, he'd tell them about the day a crying child asked for help, and he'd been smart enough to stop. He'd tell them about a woman who was too stubborn to die and too proud to accept charity, but brave enough to accept partnership. He'd tell them about building something from almost nothing, about second chances, and the courage it took to risk caring again. But mostly, he'd tell them about learning that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't to need nothing from anyone, but to let people in despite the fear, to build connections despite the risk, to choose hope despite having every reason to choose isolation instead, because in the end, that's what had saved him. Not riding away from a desperate situation, but riding toward it, and letting himself be changed by what he found there, a family forged in crisis, sustained by commitment, and deepened by the daily choice to keep showing up for each other no matter what challenges arose. Sometimes on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, and he and Clara sat watching the Montana sky fade from day to night, Elias would think about the man he'd been when he first arrived, broken, running, convinced he'd used up his allotment of happiness, and he'd marvel at the distance between that man and who he'd become. The transformation wrought not by dramatic revelation, but by the accumulation of small choices, to stay, to try, to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The road ahead still stretched uncertain, full of challenges they couldn't predict and hardships they couldn't prevent, but they'd face that road together. This family built from desperate need and stubborn hope, and the simple courage of one man who'd heard a child crying, and decided that maybe, just maybe, someone else's crisis was exactly the opportunity he'd needed to stop running from his own. And in choosing to stop, in choosing to help, in choosing to stay, Elias Thorne had found what he'd been searching for without knowing it during 3 years of restless wandering: a place to belong, a family to love, and a reason to believe that broken things could be mended if you were willing to do the work and brave enough to accept help along the way. The Montana wind still howled through the hollow on winter nights, and the summer still brought their share of heat and hardship. But inside the cabin that Jacob Vance had built, and Elias Thorne had helped sustain, there was warmth and laughter, and the kind of love that made every challenge worthwhile. They'd taken separate broken pieces and built something whole, and in doing so had proved that sometimes the best families aren't born, they're chosen.